For Unit 7, we'll cover excerpts from Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut and from Art Spiegelman's Mouse. We'll also look at Raymond Carver's story, Cathedral. Before getting to the works, let's go over the term postmodernism. Few scholars of literature and culture are likely to dispute its significance, but it still remains a vexed term about which there is much debate. Some have posited a temporal definition. In this definition, postmodernism, or POMO for short, is the art and literature that comes after modernism, both extending and reacting to the principles that infuse that movement. And this is pretty basic and seems pretty simplistic. But there's a big problem with this definition. If we accept a temporally based definition, then all art and literature produced after about 1950 would be postmodernist, and that term would lose its conceptual power. And it just isn't the case that all works produced after 1950 are postmodern. Instead of labeling all work published after 1950, we can instead look at postmodern influence on work in this period. More useful definitions of postmodernism are those that describe it in terms of a set of philosophical assumptions and approaches to art and culture described by French theorists. Jean-François Lyotard is one such theorist. He describes the basic premise of postmodernism as a lack of belief in an overarching, all-encompassing explanations that he calls meta-narratives. You don't have to remember the French critic, but you want to hang on to the idea. Postmodernist works question the notion of an absolute truth. Truth is relative in postmodern works. In many works published after World War II, you will see the tendency to offer multiple perspectives of events, people, and ideas, with each perspective changing the way we think of that event, person, or idea. Later in the semester, you will see Maxine Hong Kingston imagining various versions of her paternal aunt, presenting her alternatively as a victim of sexual assault and also as a woman indulging her desire by engaging in an extramarital affair. And both versions have their truth. Another French cultural theorist, Jean Baudrillard, looks back to linguistic insights of Ferdinand de Saussure to delineate postmodernism. This idea overturns common sense notions of language, the idea that a word refers directly to a thing that exists in the world. Saussure argued that a word or signifier refers instead to a concept and not an objective thing in the world. Here's the idea to hang on to. Words do not mean anything in isolation, but only in relation to other words. Language is the only reality because it shapes how we view the world. Baudrillard extends this notion by arguing that the world is a simulacrum, an image of an image. Ideas and concepts don't refer to the physical world, but to other forms of representation. Reality is always mediated. We don't have direct access to it. You'll see in postmodern works the notion that no ultimate reality exists. The popular Matrix trilogy, popular movies you might be familiar with, was heavily influenced by and makes allusions to the idea of a simulacrum. The Matrix is a simulacrum. The film makes many connections to Baudrillard's book. Neo, for example, is seen with a copy of Simulacra and Simulation at the beginning of The Matrix. He uses the hollowed-out book as a hiding place for cash and his important computer files. Instead of an absolute truth, postmodern writers often place great emphasis on process. This is because, 1, there isn't an absolute or universal truth, or 2, truth is too difficult to determine. All the writers assigned for today emphasize the problems inherent in attempting to communicate a history, an idea, or a concept. Technique-wise, postmodernist texts are very similar to modernist texts. They featured scrambled chronologies, stream of consciousness, wordplay, multiple perspectives, and a mixture of high and low forms of culture. So you see lots of allusions to popular culture and tradition. And you'll remember all of those techniques from The Wasteland. Be on the lookout for these techniques in Slaughterhouse-Five. For example, Vonnegut infuses the introductory chapter with language reminiscent of popular comedy. He likes one-liners and quick isolated observations that suggest stand-up. I can almost hear the drum taps after some of his quips. For example, when someone reveals that they hadn't known about the war's destruction, he replies, "Well, there hadn't been much publicity, but The tone is sarcastic while also revealing the absurdity of such a statement. There are frequent digressions as well. The narrator distracts us from the war story as he elaborates other works, and these include a dirty limerick, the Jan Janssen poem, details he gets from the Air Force that are top secret still, and The Children's Crusade, a book about Dresden by Mary Endell. To help explain the horrors of war, the narrator offers information that he has gathered as research. He tells us about the Children's Crusade of the early 13th century and offers accounts from the Old Testament. Take another look at these examples and also note that they don't really help either the narrator or us to understand the horrors of war. In these examples, Vonnegut is touching upon the postmodern idea of the simulacrum. The principal points of reference in this introduction are to other texts and not necessarily the war itself. There's little reference to an independent reality. Vonnegut, in his introductory chapter, keeps calling attention to the fact that his book about Dresden is not real. He has no words to accurately depict the experience of war. Vonnegut employs other postmodern techniques in this well-known novel. You'll notice a blurring of fact and fiction, suggesting the difficulty at arriving at a truth. Vonnegut tells us he is writing a true history about World War I, but he also appears to be writing a novel, and he appears as a character in this fictional work. The introduction also calls attention to itself as a work of art in its account of an author trying to write a work of fiction based on a horrific first-hand experience. He emphasizes his process, which is embodied in the elaborate story outlines and diagrams he describes. But truth remains ever elusive. This skepticism toward our ability to arrive at the truth, and that's truth with a capital T, is what differentiates a postmodern sensibility from a modernist one. Although postmodern and modern works employ similar techniques, they differ in philosophical outlook and in purpose. Modernists believed in the possibility of the grand narrative, that there is a story which can embody an absolute truth. For example, during Hemingway's career, there was the assumption about the possibility of writing the great American novel. Works influenced by postmodernism, however, question the notion that a work could ever reflect a universal experience. Furthermore, while both modernism and postmodernism use fragments of art and literature of the past in their own works, modernists do so respectfully. You can see T.S. Eliot, he's in awe of those classical texts that he cites throughout that wasteland. But postmodern writers like Vonnegut tend to use such fragments in an ironic way. Vonnegut is not just playing it for laughs, however. His postmodern play has a serious undertone. We see this in the pastiche of styles, his mixture of a war story with memoirs of a tragic comedic life in upstate New York. Most stories about World War II depict the catastrophe of war up close. Slaughterhouse-Five is unusual in that it situates those horrors at a distance and within the context of life after the war, where the return of routine and the onset of forgetfulness can transform memories to the point that truth seems like only a dream. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, another World War II account, like Slaughterhouse-Five, reveals the influence of postmodernism as well. And I think we can safely call this work postmodern. When it appeared on the New York Times bestseller list for fiction, Spiegelman called the Times and asked them to remove it, telling them that his work was not fiction, but memoir. The review editor replied, and I'm paraphrasing here, "If I go knock on your door and a big mouse answers, then I'll remove it from the fiction list." Since then, a separate category for graphic novels has been created. In Mouse, Vladek is witness to events at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Since 1933, Nazis had been imprisoning those they had perceived as enemies, political opponents, trade unionists, gypsies, homosexuals. The general roundup of Jews began in about 1938. Auschwitz was built in 1940 near Poland and part of the area annexed by Germany at that time. It became an extermination camp in 1942. It housed a labor camp and a sub-camp called Birkenau, which had 4 gas chambers. The Auschwitz Gassings took place at Birkenau, as many as 6,000 a day. Up to 1.5 million Jewish men, women, and children, and 100,000 victims from other ethnic groups were killed at this camp, and only 7,650 surviving prisoners were found alive at liberation. This is the horrific context behind Vladek's story. As in Vonnegut, though, we see a mixture of genres that take it away from the usual war story. In the opening panels of the excerpt included in our Norton, Spiegelman comes upon his father in the midst of a domestic spat with his father's wife and offers us a scene that seems to spring right out of a television sitcom. We see an old couple quarreling with each other about old and banal matters, threatening to break up when there's no real chance that they will do so or that any of this will change. They could be George Costanza's parents from Seinfeld. Placing the scene in a Holocaust narrative is an example of defamiliarization, a technique that involves presenting something common in an unfamiliar or strange way. And it forces us, as Slaughterhouse-Five does, to consider the lingering effects of the Holocaust on those who survive. Using the comic book form to depict one of the most horrible chapters in the history of the 20th century is controversial. Critics of Maus have stated that the form demeans the gravity of the Holocaust experience. Others believe the contrary. Others believe that it elevates the comic book to new and serious heights. About this matter, Spiegelman has much to say, and he has said, and I'm going to read this, "There's a kind of shock in people's minds when they hear that this story is a comic strip. Somebody did a comic strip about the Holocaust?" Spiegelman argues that the comic book form, actually invests it with a certain lack of hubris. It's not an opera about the Holocaust. It's something modest. It's a comic strip, a medium that has a history of being without pretensions or aspirations to art. And perhaps if there can be no art about the Holocaust, then there may be at least comic strips. Other scholars, and teachers in particular, have praised the book's ability to reach a younger generation who has been raised on television and movies and other visual media, including sequential art. Maus also reveals the influence of postmodernism in its self-consciousness. Maus isn't just an account about the Holocaust, it is also an account about telling and understanding and remembering the Holocaust. How do you communicate this horrible moment? Spiegelman pays close attention to highlighting this as an individual account. This selection from Maus focuses on the kind of story that might fade into the background in accounts of the Holocaust, a story about hiding in basements and barns, about taking chances in the streets of cities and villages. There are no grand heroics, but this story is similar to tens of thousands of such stories, and Maus foregrounds the importance of telling, remembering, and bearing witness, no matter how difficult. There are lots of difficulties too, and these include the strained relationship between Vladek and his son, the erosion of memory, the impossibility of words to describe what needs to be recollected and told. The visual experience adds to the narrative. The figures here are stiff and the images are stark and austere. They're black and white. He doesn't use much color. The effect is to call attention to the narrative as a representation of reality as opposed to reality itself. The animal characterization works similarly, highlighting the ways people of different nationalities were defined and stereotyped. Mostly, Spiegelman's use of frames is traditional, but this use can also be seen as a way to frame or contain the Holocaust, keeping it separate from the here and now. It doesn't always work. As you'll see on page 1060, an image from the past intrudes upon a frame depicting the present day of the narrative. No matter how hard they try, the characters in Maus can't escape the Holocaust. Unlike Vonnegut and Spiegelman, the writer Raymond Carver is not usually described as a postmodern writer. Instead, he is classified as a later-day realist. The movement toward resolution at the story's end could also be seen as a rejection of postmodernism's skepticism. Get in, get out, don't linger, go on. This is how Raymond Carver has described the unmistakable signature of his writing. Considered by many to be the most influential American short story writer since Ernest Hemingway, Carver's style is marked by precision of language and realistic, often stark description. He has also been called a minimalist, but Carver himself absolutely loathed that description. He felt that it suggested a narrow vision of life, low ambitions, and limited cultural horizons. Those are his words, not mine. His widow, the poet Tess Gallagher, has been active in publishing original versions of his stories before they had been edited by Gordon Lish, to show that Carver envisioned a very different style of his work. Those qualities associated with minimalism, Gallagher argues, are the result of Lish's influence and not Carver's original intention. And if you have some time, I suggest looking at some of the original versions of his well-known stories. Carver's characters in general have been described as diminished and lost. We see these qualities in the narrator of Cathedral. This is not a happy individual, and he doesn't really try to hide that fact. This narrator uses a conspiratorial tone as he tells his story to us. He talks directly to us, telling us exactly how he feels without trying to impress or sway us into liking him. In fact, in many ways, he's very unlikable. He makes wise cracks, sometimes making jokes about the blind. And yet we feel that he is not totally without feeling. He seems jealous of Robert, his wife's oldest friend and confidant. The relationship between Robert and his wife predates the narrator's own relationship with his wife. His observations and jealousy of the relationship between Robert and the wife suggest he wants something more from his relationship. The wife goes to great lengths to communicate with her friend who is blind, which is a feature that is highlighted throughout the story. They exchange audio tapes with one another in which she reveals her thoughts about the most important events in her life, a previous marriage that had ended in divorce, several moves across country, and an attempted suicide. She even provides details about her current relationship with the narrator. He tells us, and I quote, "She and I began going out, and of course she told her blind man about it. She told him everything, or so it seemed to me." The narrator is jealous, but continually fails to create the kind of intimate communication shared between his wife and her friend Robert. He doesn't listen to the tapes when his wife offers to share them, and when she shows him her poetry, which he dismisses as recreation, he tells us, "I can remember I didn't think much of the poem. Of course, I didn't tell her that." The events in Cathedral take place in a single setting, the home of the narrator, and on a single night. Despite the ordinary situation, Robert's visit initiates the potential for change in the marriage. And there is a transformation, not in the marriage, but in the relationship between Robert and the narrator. This is initiated by cathedrals, which enter the story only in the third section. Cathedrals are the subject of the television documentary that the narrator and Robert discuss. Carver writes, "In the olden days when they built cathedrals, men wanted to be close to God," the narrator says. "In those olden days, God was a part of everyone's life." After Robert asks him if he is in any way religious, the narrator reveals, "I guess I don't believe in it, in anything. Sometimes it's hard." That sounds very postmodern, actually. In an interview, Carver himself acknowledges his intention here. And this is what he says. "Well, the character there is full of prejudices against blind people. He changes, he grows. I'd never written a story like that. Then when I wrote that story, I felt it was truly different. I felt a real impetus in writing it, and that doesn't happen with every story. But I felt I tapped into something. I felt it was very exciting. The sighted man changes. He puts himself in the blind man's place. The story affirms something. It's a positive story, and I like it a lot for that reason. People say it's a metaphor for some other thing, for art, for making. But no, I thought about the physical contact of the blind man's hand on his hand. It's all imaginary. Nothing like that ever happened to me. Although there's nothing to indicate that the narrator changes his mind about religion by the end of the story, there is a type of transcendence as he and Robert communicate by working on something together. We're not sure how this will affect his relationship with his wife after the story ends, but she may learn to see her husband differently, just as he has learned to see a blind man in a new way. We'll look at other postmodern works later in the semester. Thanks.